You're listening to Talking Freely, where we discuss culture, politics, and religious freedom. Talking Freely is a podcast from Freedom for Faith, a Christian legal think tank that exists to protect and promote religious freedom in Australia.
Welcome to Talking Freely. My name is Rowan McHugh. Our very first guest on the Talking Freely podcast is Vic Alhadeff, who is the CEO of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. His organisation refers to itself as the representative roof body of the Jewish community. It leads, speaks and advocates on behalf of the New South Wales Jewish community, with 55 major communal organisations as its constituents. Vic, thanks very much for being with us today on Talking Freely.
You're very welcome, Rowan. Good to be here.
Here at Freedom for Faith, our mission is to protect and promote religious freedom for all faiths in Australia. An interesting question within Judaism is what constitutes a Jewish identity beyond faith? There are matters of ethnicity, culture, personhood, and so on. For the benefit of our listeners, perhaps, Vic, you could unpack different aspects of what it means to be Jewish and how it differs from other religions in that way.
So I certainly cannot speak for other religions, but you've touched on very accurately some of what it does mean to be Jewish, and that is it is more than, and I put just in inverted commas, it is more than just a faith. It is about peoplehood, it's about religion, it's about faith, it's about culture, it's about tradition, it's about being a people, and it's all of those going back 5,000 years. And so there's a very strong and rich tradition of being Jewish in terms of culture, in terms of foods, in terms of clothing. Jewish people come from the four corners of the globe, and perhaps less so now than Jewish people once did. But if one takes Israel as a microcosm, because like Australia, like the United States, it is one of the most multicultural nations in the world. And if you take Israel as a microcosm of the Jewish experience, you will find Jewish people who are black and who have come from Ethiopia and from Sudan and from Somalia and from Scandinavian countries and from everywhere in between. So all colors, shapes and sizes, different cultures, ethnicities, foods, traditions, clothing. So it's a very broad tapestry of experiences in culture, tradition, food. So it's about peoplehood, it's about faith, it's about tradition, all of the above, and of course a very strong connection to the land, being the land of Israel, and all of that feeds into Jewish identity. In addition to that, there is the negative, tragic aspect of the Jewish story, and that is, of course, the genocide, and I'm talking about the Holocaust, obviously, excuse me, and that is a seminal aspect of the Jewish psyche to this day, because, and this is obviously not a comparative thing or a worse genocide, every genocide is horrendous and to be absolutely condemned. But what is unique about the genocide against the Jewish people, which was the Holocaust, is that it was a determination to kill every Jew on the planet, no matter where or when that person was born, no matter whether that was a baby of 2 days old or a grandmother of 99 years old. And I mentioned that distinction because if you took the Rwandan genocide, for example, in 1994 in Africa, if the Tutsi were able to hop onto a plane and fly to Paris, the Hutu were not chasing them. So it was as much a function of geography as of ethnic rivalry. Whereas the Holocaust was a plan, as I mentioned, to kill every Jew on the planet, to eliminate Jewish presence off the face of the earth completely. And so that chilling rationale which underpinned the Holocaust is part of the Jewish story, tragically, and is part of the Jewish psyche as well, and comes into awareness of what it means to be Jewish, as well as, of course, all the positive aspects of it, which I mentioned at the outset.
We're soon to approach the 82nd anniversary of Kristallnacht on the 9th of November. That's considered a very solemn day for Jewish people all over the world. Could you describe what Kristallnacht refers to and why it remains such a significant event to commemorate today?
So Kristallnacht is a German word which translates literally to crystal night, and more colloquially, if I can use that expression, to night of broken glass. And that the reason that is a significant date on the Jewish calendar is that essentially marked the onset of the Holocaust. And what happened there was that on November 9th and 10th, 1938, in Germany and Austria, German and Austrian military, paramilitary people in uniform took to the streets and essentially began what was the beginning of the Holocaust. Smashed synagogues, set fire to synagogues, smashed and set fire to Jewish-owned businesses, assaulted Jewish people who were unfortunate enough to be walking in the streets at the time. So approximately about 100 Jewish people were killed on the streets. Thousands of Jewish people were rounded up and arrested. And as I say, synagogues and Jewish-owned businesses set fire and or destroyed. And that was 1938, November 9th and 10th. So essentially a year before World War II, which, as we know, September the 3rd, 1939, a year later. But this essentially marked the beginning of the Holocaust. And so every year on November 9th, Jewish communities around the world, including right here in Australia, of course, mark that date as the beginning of the Holocaust. And we hold a ceremony where we reflect on what took place and then how that just, got worse, essentially, and evolved into what we know today as the Holocaust almost 1 year later.
More than most people groups, Jews, it seems, are acutely aware that history can very cruelly repeat itself. Enslavement under Pharaoh, the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, and of course, if you've touched on the Holocaust. How do you think the Jewish memory of these events affects the way they understand their place in 21st century Australia?
There was an excellent article in The Australian a couple of years ago now by Noel Pearson, who is an Indigenous leader who is, if I may say, an outstanding Aboriginal leader, outstanding Australian leader. And in that article, he talked about, he said that Aboriginal people need to learn from the Jewish people. And this is, I'm mentioning this in response to your question. And he said, need to learn in two ways. And the one is he spoke about, he said, the Aboriginal people, like the Jewish people, have a rich history and culture and tradition going back thousands of years. However, Jewish people, at the same time, while holding to and embracing culture and traditions, etc., going back thousands of years, at the same time, get involved in a very proactive and productive way in modern society. In other words, become engineers and nurses and lawyers and psychologists and activists in human rights causes, etc. Equally, said Noel Pearson, the Jewish people have suffered a genocide, the Holocaust, but have not become victims to it. In fact, the reverse. Jewish people make a point of extrapolating the positives out of a genocide. What I mean by that is extrapolating out of that the positive lessons from a genocide, which is understanding and learning from where racial hatred can lead and where any forms of bigotry can lead, and turning that around so that we take those lessons to wider society and have a clear focus on respect for difference, respect for diversity, have warning bells when we see all forms of bigotry happening anywhere against any demographic, whether that be women or Filipinos or Vietnamese or Muslims or Jews or Christians. And so so to answer your question in terms of where we see our place in Australian society, it is making a contribution in terms of helping, doing whatever we can to upbuild civil society, to promote social harmony, social inclusion through the prism of the Jewish experience, which has its absolutely positive, overwhelmingly positive experience, at the same time tempered by the genocide which Jewish people have experienced. And using both of those divergent experiences to contribute to upbuilding what I honestly believe is the greatest nation in the world, that being Australia.
Turning to your current role as CEO of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, give us an overview of the various functions of your organisation in terms of that Jewish contribution and how it connects Jewish communities to Australian life.
Our mandate is the mandate of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, which represents the New South Wales Jewish community, is about promoting social harmony and promoting social inclusion. And so we expend a lot of energy in bringing different groups together. And I'll give two examples of that. At an adult level, we run a program which we call We Are All Sydney. And because that is what the program is about. And so we bring together representatives of emerging communities, such as Afghan and Somali and Sudanese and African and communities which do not have a strong or organized presence in our country, but have a presence in our country. And so we run programs to help lift those communities into civil society with basic skills and awareness of what democratic principles mean, and the right to vote, and public speaking and communications and any skills which Australians will take for granted, because that's what we do and experience and are privileged to experience in a democratic country. And so we run programs like that. Equally, at a high school level, we run a program called Respect, Understanding, Acceptance, where every year, and obviously this 2020 has been unfortunately impacted because of COVID, but up until this year, every year we bring together approximately 1,000 high school kids in groups of 100 at a time. And the rationale in bringing them together is for those students to get to know each other, respect each other as Australian kids who happen to have different backgrounds, whether that be Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Aboriginal, Filipino, or whatever it is. And with a strong anti-racism component built into the program. So those two programs, a young adult level, high school level, the aim there is to promote respect for each other as Australians of whatever color, shapes, or size. At the same time, the other side of the ledger of our work is combating bigotry, combating racism, combating anti-Semitism. And that takes a lot of our energy and a lot of our work. And unfortunately, Rowan, we have experienced and we continue to experience a spike in anti-Semitic incidents in the last 2 years, 2019, 2020, in the workplace, on the university campuses, at high schools, and in some aspects of media, etc. And so that is a very important focus of our work as well.
When we consider how ubiquitous persecution has been over history against different ethnicities, races, and religions, why do you think that anti-Semitism in particular has proven to be so persistent throughout the ages?
That's a very vexed question. The single biggest cause, and there are a lot of causes and factors, and the single biggest reason, if I can use that word, which has underpinned anti-Semitism for 2,000 years, has been the allegation that the Jews killed Jesus. Now, the Jews were not responsible for the death of Jesus, and the Pope himself, the Vatican itself, in 1965, so we're talking 70 years ago, issued a very important landmark statement in 1965 called Nostra Aetate, which translated from the Latin to In Our Times. in which the Vatican itself, the Pope himself, said that the Jews were not responsible for the death of Jesus. And yet, despite that statement coming from the Vatican itself, very sadly, and that false allegation has perpetuated somehow through the years and has underpinned so much of the anti-Semitism which we continue to experience to this day. And obviously, there are other far more basic reasons, and social media and everyone has an iPhone, and while that can be a wonderful source of information, equally it is also a toxic source of poison and fabrications and allegations, etc. And it is all too easy, and we see it, for people in the anonymity of their homes in the middle of the night to be pressing a button, and a billion people can read the most terrible allegations and accusations, etc., and poisonous messages. And that in itself lends itself all too easily to terrible bigotry against all groups, etc. And the Jewish community sadly experiences that as well. And we see it, and we measure the increase in that, and very much more so in the last couple of years. And why in the last couple of years? It's it's difficult always to pinpoint reasons, specific reasons, but there are extremist groups on the hard left, on the hard right, and who sadly engage in this sort of poison.
In the last 50 years, most people in Australia have grown up in relatively peaceful circumstances, which tempts us to think that atrocities or persecutions are just something of the past, that we can now instead rely on international rights guarantees and a more tolerant society in general. What are your reflections on this commonly held perspective?
It is all too dangerous to believe that genocides and mass killings, etc., are a thing of the past. And just in the last 2 years alone, in 2019, 2020, we have seen mass shootings in different places around the world. In our own neck of the woods, in Christchurch, on March the 15th, 2019, where 51 members of the New Zealand Muslim community were gunned down in a most horrendous mass killing. And just to digress for a moment, as the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, we organized a crowdfunding from within the Jewish community here in New South Wales, and we managed to raise $70,000. And I flew down to Christchurch and visited both mosques where the shootings took place, paid my respects to the imams there, and then we had a modest ceremony in the chambers of the mayor of Christchurch, and presented her with a check to be distributed for purposes of medical care, education for the families which had suffered that terrible genocide. Also, in the last little while, we have seen shootings at synagogues in Pittsburgh in the United States. And so mass killings continue to this day. And so it is a false luxury, which is inaccurate, to believe that we have put these sorts of this sort of conduct behind us. And even as we speak, and the details are still unfolding, but just in Vienna today, in Austria, there's been killings, and the details are still emerging, but apparently in 6 different locations, which means 6 different gunmen. And so, sadly, it's bigotry is still not only is still there, but continues. And there seems to be a greater tolerance of intolerance, a greater intolerance of bigotry, intolerance of difference. And so it takes leadership, and it takes leadership from civil society right across the board for people to condemn bigotry and make it clear that there is no room in our society for those who engage in hatred and those who act out on those hatreds.
Now, your organisation is also a member of the Keep New South Wales Safe coalition, which has many ethnic and religious organisations under its umbrella. You personally led their successful campaign for a new anti-incitement law in 2018. Can you take us through that new law and how it will address some of the concerns that we've talked about?
The trigger for that campaign was a horrendous speech on the streets of Sydney in 2014, so 6 years ago, by an extremist leader. And he gave a public speech in which he incited not just violence, but even death against Jewish people. And at the time, this came to our attention on a YouTube in 2015. And at the time it happened, we lodged a complaint with the Anti-Discrimination Board of New South Wales, asking that legal action be taken. And nothing happened. And so when we saw that nothing happened, and under the law as it was, and the law which applied was Section 20D of the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act. And under that law, there was a 6-month window for legal action to be taken in response to an incident such as the one I just mentioned. And when that six-month window closed, we thought that if you can give a speech on the streets of Sydney inciting violence against any demographic in Australia, and the law does nothing, then it puts everyone at risk. And we equally concluded that this is a whole of society issue. And so we set about putting together a coalition. And we call this coalition Keep New South Wales Safe. And there's a website, keepnswsafe.com, and on which you will see approximately 34 logos of different communities, and it runs A through Z, A being Armenian, Chinese, Greek, Muslim, Christian, Vietnamese, and I said A through Z. The Z was, I was born in Zimbabwe, and there was the Z. And in the name of this Keep New South Wales Safe Alliance and Keep New South Wales Safe campaign, you're absolutely right, I spearheaded this campaign. And over the next 3 years, so 2015, 16, 17, into 2018, we had between 150 and 200 meetings with members of parliament, think tanks, media interviews, television, radio, newspapers, online, in which we put a proposal to the New South Wales government. And the proposal said, and a bill which we proposed said, if you incite violence on the basis of race, religion, gender, sexual preference, a number of other categories, then that right there is a crime. Because the problem with the law as it was up until that point, and this was a law which Nick Greiner, to his credit, had brought in way back in 1989. The problem with the law was that you needed to establish a causal connection between what somebody said and someone acting out an act of violence. And our proposal said, if you incite violence on these categories, that is a crime right there. You do not wait for someone to act upon it. And after these, as I said, these many, many meetings, media interviews, etc., on June 27, 2018, Section 93Z of the New South Wales Crimes Act came into being. And that is a new law which says if you incite violence on those categories, that is a law right there. It is a campaign and an outcome of which we are exceptionally proud, and I do not resolve from that, because the beneficiaries are every single member of the state, every single adult, child, baby, senior citizen, because it is designed to keep all of us safe from violence and from threats of violence. And so, as I said, June 27, 2018, Section 93Z of the New South Wales Crimes Act came into being.
Given the increase in anti-Semitic incidents that you've previously touched on, are there any further changes to the law that you believe would improve religious freedom protections or indeed reverse the trends of anti-Semitism?
Ideally, we would like to see that law become a national law, because the beneficiaries, as I've said, are everyone. And the beneficiaries are, no matter what color, shape, size you are, no matter what culture, tradition, faith group, everyone should be protected from violence and from threats of violence. And so ideally, we would like to see that law become a national law. It should apply to every Australian, everywhere. And that is, in a nutshell, a change to the law, to the national law, which we would like to see. We would like to see 93Z become a piece of federal legislation.
An enduring debate that goes on in Western nations is the balancing act between freedoms and prohibitions. An example in Australia was the proposed 18C amendments to the Racial Discrimination Act. Can you take us through why the Jewish community objected to those proposals and how those objections are consistent with free expression?
So you're absolutely right. Of course, there is a balancing act, and our freedoms are precious to us. They are part of our democracy, our democratic principles, our democratic rights, and the rights of people under civil society. And the debate, just very briefly, when the 18C debate occurred, and what that was about was 18C is a piece of federal legislation. And in fact, that debate occurred at the same time that I was leading the campaign for the New South Wales legislation 93Z. And so there was an understandable confusion among punters about the two pieces of legislation. What was the difference then? Was 18C, I beg your pardon, was essentially about freedom of speech. And our concern was, and it was about hate speech. It was about hate speech, sorry, not about freedom of speech, about hate speech. And our concern was that there were people who wanted to throw out 18C. And our concern was that 18C was about hate speech and about making hate speech an offense. And the feeling of the Jewish community is that if you throw out 18C, you'll be exposing people to hate speech. And we didn't want to expose anyone to hate speech. Going back to the New South Wales campaign for 93Z, that was a more focused campaign. And my work was cut out to draw a distinction between 18C, the federal law, which was about hate speech, and what I was focusing on for New South Wales, which is about incitement to violence on the basis of race, religion, gender, sexual preference. And I needed to draw a distinction and drive a track between those two pieces of legislation. And in terms of the New South Wales legislation, the first time that the Attorney General, an outstanding individual named Mark Speakman, took the proposed legislation to the New South Wales Cabinet, it was actually thrown out. And so we then narrowed the focus of the campaign from hate speech, this is in New South Wales, to incitement to violence. And on that basis, it passed the New South Wales government, party room, lower house, upper house. So 18C was about federal legislation about hate speech. 93Z was New South Wales legislation, was about incitement to violence. And that was the difference between the two.
Another piece of legislation that our audience may be less aware of is the Section 20D provisions in New South Wales. Could you also just provide a bit of information on your engagement with that provision?
The 20D New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act was brought in by Premier Nick Ryan in 1989, and full credit to him for so doing, because the intention was absolutely important and very important. However, the problem with that legislation was that it was complicated, it was convoluted, as a result of which, when this gentleman, I use the word gentleman rather loosely, gave this terrible speech in 2014 inciting violence against Jews, the problem with 20D, which was the law which should have taken effect against him, was too complicated and was totally useless. And in fact, since 1989, since that law came in, there has been, to this day, not a single prosecution under that law. Not a single conviction, not even a charge was laid under that law. So that tells you one of two things. Either we live in Camelot or the law is hopeless, because those are the only two options which present themselves. And sadly, it was the second one, that the law was too complicated, too convoluted to be effective. And that was why the law was rendered completely ineffective when there was the terrible speech inciting violence and inciting death against Jewish people in 2014, and that then triggered the campaign which we led, which resulted in Section 93Z of the Crimes Act.
When thinking through your engagement on these various pieces of legislation, how do you broadly understand the difference of the Jewish approach to religious freedom compared with other religions?
It's a very broad and complex area. We share the approach of mainstream religions, of other religions in terms of wanting to protect religious freedoms. That said, it is a complex area because nobody should be able to stand up in Martin Place and, in the name of religious freedom, incite violence against somebody else. So religious freedoms are absolutely core to our democratic principles and our democratic way of life. The caveat, the caution is, one should not be able to do whatever one wants in the name of religious freedom, e.g., the example I've just said. You can come from Mars and say, our beliefs on Mars is that we condemn people who practice X religion, and therefore we're inciting violence against people who practice X religion. And the person who says that might be doing it with the utmost sincerity. Well, that is where we would argue one has to draw the line. We absolutely support religious freedom. However, one should not be able to incite violence against any other religious group because of a belief that you might hold. And so it's a complex area. There are no easy answers, and it takes a sensitive and considered approach to these issues.
A welcome trend we've seen in recent years is different religious groups working together as advocates for religious freedom: Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, and so on. What effect has that solidarity had on your hopes for the protection of religious freedom?
That is a wonderful manifestation, and we work together with different cultures and faiths and groups right across the board. So, e.g., as I mentioned earlier, in our campaign for Keep New South Wales Safe, we brought together the last time I checked, there were 34 different logos on that website. So that's 34 different communities, groups: Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, Christians, turbans for Australia, people, different cultures and faiths and colors across the board. On a different matter, it's not a religious freedom matter, but it's a matter where, again, we work closely together. A number of faith groups, including Catholics, including modern Orthodox Christian groups, Muslim groups, Jewish groups, are facing a critical shortage in cemetery space here in New South Wales right now. And so we are working closely together with our friends in the Catholic world, with our friends in the Muslim world, with with a number of different faith groups in doing whatever we can to address this critical shortage. So on a range of issues, we not just go looking for, but the commonalities are there. We share values, and this is very encouraging. And this is what makes Australia one of the most successful multicultural nations in the world, is that we do find and work together with our common values, common interests, and that's very much the good news in what makes Australia the great country that it is.
Vic, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you very much indeed for being with us today on Talking Freely.
Absolutely a pleasure, Rowan. Thank you very much.
That's it for our latest episode of Talking Freely. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can do so through our website, www.freedomforfaith.org.au. Freedom for Faith exists through the generous donations of individuals and organisations across Australia. If you'd like to financially partner with us, you can do so through our website.